So this video is going to be a continuation of the previous video, part 1, that I just finished. But I also wanted to refer to some historical texts that will give support for the papacy. And I want to do this because a lot of times people will say things like, oh, there were no popes until the Middle Ages, and it wasn't until then that the papacy came into being because these people were trying to usurp political power and things like that. And these were all things that I believed until I started to look into the evidence for myself. And what I found was really surprising. And first, I would really encourage you to get a volume of early church fathers' writings. These are the writings from the leaders of the church from the first few centuries all up until the Reformation. You can get writings from all sorts of different time periods. I've read mostly from the very earliest centuries because mostly I've been asking questions about what those very first centuries were like. But you can get a set of volumes such as The Faith of the Early Fathers. Look for that. There's a 3-volume set that's really great. And there's no commentary or anything like that. It's just the writings themselves and a great index in the back. So I would encourage you to do that. But if you don't have those kinds of books right now, I just wanted to share a few of these writings that I found that show you that the papacy, or the basis of the papacy, was already fully fledged, fully in place in the very first centuries of the church, and that this interpretation of Matthew 16 that I talk about in the previous video was the original interpretation. That was how the people who were instructed from the apostles interpreted this passage. So I want to start with a quote from Cyprian, and this quote was made in the year 251 AD. This was now more than 100 years before the New Testament had even been canonized. So this is very early in the church. And Cyprian said, "The Lord says to Peter, I say to you," he says, "that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. And to you I will give the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed also in heaven." And again he says to him after his resurrection, "Feed my sheep." On him he builds the church, and to him he gives the command to feed the sheep. And although he assigns a like power to all the apostles, yet he founded a single chair, and he established by his own authority a source and an intrinsic reason for that unity. Indeed, the others were that also which Peter was, but a primacy was given to Peter, whereby it is made clear that there is but one church and one chair. So too all are shepherds, and the flock is shown to be one, fed by all the apostles in single-minded accord. If someone does not hold fast to this unity of Peter, can he imagine that he still holds to the faith? If he desert the chair of Peter, upon whom the church was built, can he still be confident that he is in the church? So we can see here that this interpretation of Matthew 16, which says that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built, and that he was given authority, and that we are to see this as the chair of Peter, is the correct interpretation, or at least a very early interpretation, as they were already saying this in AD 251. And but then we can say, well, this still doesn't say that we think that that there was any succession from the chair of Peter, and that all of the popes that have followed Peter really have the same authority that Peter did. And that was a new idea in the Middle Ages, but that's not the case either. And here I want to quote Irenaeus, who wrote this in 180 AD, so even sooner. This is possibly only 30 years after the second epistle of Peter was written in the New Testament. And Irenaeus, just a little background on Irenaeus, he was the disciple, I believe, of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. So everything that Irenaeus knows and was teaching is what he learned from Polycarp, who learned from the Apostle John, which was the disciple that Jesus loved. So I find what he says to be particularly interesting and particularly authoritative because he was not very far removed. And here's something that Irenaeus says. Since, however, it would be very tedious in such a volume as this to reckon up the successions of all the churches, we do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, whether by an evil self-pleasing or vainglory, or by blindness or perverse opinion, assemble in unauthorized meetings. We do this, I say, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles, of the very great, the very ancient, and the universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the two most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the successions of bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church, on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolic tradition has been preserved continuously by those faithful men who exist everywhere. The blessed apostles, having founded and built up the Church of Rome, they handed over the office of the episcopate to Linus. Paul makes mention of this Linus in the epistle to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was chosen for the episcopate. So now, if you keep reading from Irenaeus' letters, which is against heresies, he'll list, all of the successions of bishops from Peter to his present day. And what you see here is really proof that there was this idea that Peter had a prime position. He was given this primacy by Jesus, and he handed on this position then to the next person, and on to the next person as the Bishop of Rome. And to this, to that time in 180 AD, when Irenaeus wrote this letter, he was saying that this Bishop of Rome, this Church of Rome, is a church with which all churches must agree, because unity was through Peter, through that chair of Peter, which was founded in Rome. And you'll see, if you look into some of the history, you'll see that both Peter and Paul were in Rome, and were both martyred there in Rome. Rome was really their church at the end, towards the end of their life, at least, probably for most of Peter's ministry. And finally, one last quote I just wanted to show you. It's a shorter one. It's from a little bit later, and this is from Optatus of Milev, if I'm pronouncing that right. And this one was written in 367 AD. And Optatus says, "You cannot deny that you know that in the city of Rome the chair was first conferred on Peter, in which the prince of all the apostles, Peter, sat, in which chair unity should be preserved by all, so that he should now be a schismatic and a sinner who should set up another chair against that unique one." That's just another example. And if you read in the church fathers, the writings of the church fathers, you'll see this everywhere. And when I first saw this, when I was still a Protestant, and actually I had been considering becoming Orthodox because I had so much trouble accepting the idea of the papacy, even though I was finding so many other Catholic ideas to be very true. I was still fighting against the papacy, and I thought that it was not around in the early centuries of the church. And when I read these, I knew that this was the original interpretation of Matthew 16, and that this is what Jesus had intended. And especially when I was able to tie this back, as I talk about in my previous video, part 1 of this set of videos, that this tied back to the chair of Moses and to the authority that the Pharisees had. It all came together, and I knew that this had to be right. So I hope that this video will kind of spark your interest, and that you'll pick up The Faith of the Early Fathers, that volume set of writings, and you'll take a look at this yourself. You'll look into this question of the papacy, and hopefully you'll find some really fascinating things. And like me, though it was the thing that I fought the hardest and I was so against for so long, now I can tell you I'm so happy to have it, and to have that authority and that way to understand that living voice that is here today. And it's really wonderful. So I just want to end with that, and I thank you for listening. And let me know if you have questions, and I'd love to discuss. And I just want to say God bless to all of you. Thank you.